the 2014 ICAA Luncheon Keynote speaker, Judy Trees. Judy and I are close colleagues and friends for many years, and for many of you, she really does not need an introduction. She is a giant in the field of aging and immigration, and actually a pioneer in work dealing with theoretical developments in adaptation and incorporation. Let me give you a brief bio sketch of Judy. She received her PhD from UCLA in sociology, and she also did her undergraduate work at Pfizer in California. She is a Californian because after she graduated with her PhD, she went on to USC and spent many years there in gerontology, working very hard on these issues. Then she was launched to another California institution, UC Irvine, where she was the first professor to be able to actually design and create a department of sociology with a focus on aging and the life course. She is currently professor of sociology and director of the Center for Demographic and Social Analysis at UC Irvine, so she wears quite a few hats. She is also very intellectually versatile. Her research focuses not only on older immigrants, but she does work on gender and aging, international families, and particularly how men and women negotiate their relationship. She is prolific. She has over 100 publications. I'm sure many of you have read them. Her work appeared in the gold standard of our discipline of sociology, ASR, social forces, but also she blends this work so brilliantly with her gerontological research. Her work has been recognized by our national organizations. In 2010, she was the Matilda White Riley Distinguished Scholar for our section on aging and the life course. This is a major achievement. And in 2012, she was recognized by the Gerontological Society of America for her work, her theoretical work. I could say much more than this about Judy's accomplishments, but I know we are very eager to hear her presentation today entitled, What Older Immigrants Teach Us About Later Life. This is going to happen.
It's always wonderful to be introduced by Jackie, as you can tell. And I'd also like to give a shout out to the other organizers. I've heard a few people mention that they were feeling lightheaded, and they sort of attributed this to the altitude. Now I've got to say I was feeling a little lightheaded, but I'm pretty sure it's just because I'm so excited to be here at the 2014 Conference on Aging in the Americas, where the field of aging really meets and embraces the diversity and globalization that are the hallmarks of the 21st century. It's just wonderful to be here, and what I'd like to do is share with you some qualitative research. We've heard superb technical papers this morning. We've come away excited about a lot of new ideas that are introduced. We heard a lot about different data sets, but I'm going to mix it up by introducing some qualitative research that I've been doing over the years involving interviews with older foreign-born adults who happen to be living in California. And my real objective is just to keep you awake after lunch. So I'm going to introduce you to some people who I think are very interesting. Jackie did such a nice job on my autobiography, but I'd like to go into a little autobiographical digression just to tell you how I got interested in older immigrants. This started about 2 decades ago when I moved to the Orange County as founding chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine. And then, as now, UCI was an extraordinarily diverse campus. We had a majority minority student body. Many of our students were from immigrant families. And it was, in fact, my undergraduate students in my sociology of aging class who first sparked my interest in older immigrants. So particularly for younger people in the audience, when they tell you that teaching doesn't have, tracks from your research, don't listen to them because sometimes it can be really very inspirational. In fact, our students teach us things. Well, I had a UCI undergraduate really early on who told me that her South Asian family was very traditional. They took care of their grandma. Apparent reference to what she saw as the callous disregard of older family members by other Americans who relied on things like nursing homes and formal services for the care of older family members. But when I pressed her for more information, her family looked less and less traditional to me. Instead of residing with her oldest son in India, as would be the custom, her grandmother had come halfway around the world to make her home with her daughter in a Mediterranean-themed suburb of Southern California. That did not sound traditional to me. And in fact, it would seem more like a reinterpretation of cultural imperatives in terms of new circumstances and new opportunities. So to frame what they were doing as traditional, I didn't think did real justice to the creativity and the initiative that this family was bringing to elder care, bringing to the preservation of family ties. I was very interested in this, and having been stimulated by my students, I saw older immigrants everywhere. And I live in a university community, and it turned out that my Irvine neighborhood was really ground zero for a new wave of immigration to the U.S., particularly that global diaspora of professionals that we've seen, and also the immigration reforms that promote family reunification. So when I first moved to Irvine, there were still older gentlemen from China who were wandering around in Mao suits. And usually a respectful distance behind them, they were followed by their wives. There were, if I went to the playground, there were talks that were being attended by their Russian grandmothers, complete with babushkas. And there was an older woman in the neighborhood who was a live-in nanny. She was from Mexico. And one day my neighbor called me over. She wanted me to see the apartment that they had built into their garage for her mother, who visited frequently from Taiwan. She was going back and forth so much they actually had to create a mother-in-law apartment. Now, I really got sensitized to this when I picked up an issue of our community newsletter. Usually the newsletter complained about speeding cars and unruly adolescents. But this particular issue actually had a public safety announcement. They suggested and reminded us not to let older parents who spoke no English leave home without written contact information, just in case they got lost. So I really saw immigrants everywhere, and yet outside their families and ethnic communities, nobody really seemed to care very much about these older newcomers. And after all, older immigrants do not win spelling bees. Older immigrants do not join criminal gangs. Older immigrants don't start Silicon Valley startups. There was very little drawing attention to older immigrants. And if this was true of the general community, it was also true of researchers. Researchers who were studying immigration were understandably preoccupied with the incorporation of working age adults and their children. Older adults, not so much. And then there were the sociologists of aging and the life course. And they didn't do much with older immigrants either. To be sure, we were very sensitive to issues of cultural diversity, but our research often ignored the nativity. It wasn't unusual to see an article on older Latinos that didn't separate out the U.S.-born older adults from their immigrant co-ethnics. They were all melded together. So I was quite interested in this, and I probably it just would have named, kind of percolated there for a long time. But Jackie Angel emailed me and said, would you be kind enough to write an article for an issue I'm editing that had something to do with public policy? And I said, yes, I would. And so that was my first publication on late life immigration. And what I relied on there were federal immigration statistics. And I won't say they told me nothing. They got me interested in independency among older adults because it became very clear that there was a real mismatch between the U.S. economy and the skills that older adults were bringing, because so many of the older immigrants entering the U.S. were coming in with very low educations and employment histories where their last job was in agriculture. And you just knew there wasn't going to be a lot for them here. And the implication was that they were probably going to be highly dependent on family for economic support. So I certainly wouldn't say I didn't learn anything, but what I learned also was that I wanted to know more, and more that I could possibly get at with existing data. I wanted to know why these interesting people in my neighborhood were here. I was interested in how they fit into American society, and questions that I just wasn't getting out of immigration statistics. So with my colleague Shamba Mazumdar, we kind of got this idea that it would be fun to study this. So we began to train and supervise undergraduate students. And then they carried out qualitative interviews with older adults. And we asked them to focus on either older adults who had permanently immigrated to the U.S., and we were particularly interested in those who were newcomers, or individuals who perhaps weren't immigrants but visited here frequently in the mode of my neighbor's mother. And eventually we had 58 interviews with older adults, mostly in their 60s and 70s, and hailing from 17 countries. Now, I've got to say that our research didn't lack for rigor, but this was not a textbook study. There was no representative sample. And in fact, it was even hard to locate these older immigrants because I was amazed how transient these older adults were. Many of them were going back and forth between California and their homes, and some of them also were on kind of a circuit where they moved from the home of one child to the home of another child to a home of another child. Sometimes within the week, I spend the week here with this kid and the weekend with another kid. So they were moving around a lot. And it was also hard to approach them because they didn't speak English. They weren't familiar with survey research methods. And they were often fiercely protected by family gatekeepers who were understandably concerned that their elderly relations not be exploited. So it turns out it was very useful having a lot of students who were themselves from immigrant families or immigrant communities. And the informants then were usually the students' older family members, or they were family friends, or they were friends' family members. Now this is a no-no in a lot of textbook methods because you might think that these arrangements would compromise objectivity. Well, looking through the transcripts, I'm not sure they did. I didn't see any evidence of this. People, in fact, seemed incredibly candid. And the intimacy indeed had certain advantages. For one thing, the students were often able to interpret the interviews in light of their own knowledge of the culture, and often their knowledge of the personal history of the informant. And furthermore, the transcriptions often captured these wonderful naturalistic moments. Basically, older people got caught. They scolded grandchildren, you better hurry up and get your citizenship because the cost is going up, up, up. Or they said something like, well, there was a nephew who interviewed his aunt, and she was clearly hoping she could send a message to the whole family about her son, who she saw as insufficiently filial. And in another instance, well, they often instructed grandchildren about customs in their culture or family history right there during the interview. So we often talk about transnational families, but actually, let me give you an example of an 83-year-old Filipina doing transnational family. In this, she's being interviewed by her grandson, but she's reminding him of another home and distant kin who take an interest in his life. She says, Adoracion, that's your aunt back in the Philippines. I don't think you remember her because you were only a baby when you went home to the Philippines. They always ask you, or ask how you are doing when I go home to the Philippines, and they tell me to bring you, your brother, and sisters to see them again. So we have a grandmother who's really implanted in the next generation an appreciation for our home in the Philippines, as well as these distant family members, even if they're not present. And this is the sort of spontaneous example of family dynamics that I haven't seen emerge from any other study of design. So apologies for any deviations from textbook evidence. I think there's something here. I learned so much about older adults and from these interviews that I really can't hope to summarize it all today. But I'm going to share 4 lessons that have stuck with me. And in part, I think they are memorable because they pointed out how little I knew. They challenge popular myths and stereotypes about older adults and immigrant families. And as I mentioned, these are individuals that are often overlooked and perhaps misunderstood. So let me move to lesson number 1. That's the question of why older people would come to the U.S. And here I'm focused particularly on people who immigrate later in life, not prime age labor migrants. It turns out this arose during the 1996 debates on welfare reform. Some of you may be old enough to remember those. And those debates often pictured older people as flocking to the U.S. in order to get federal benefits. They really wanted welfare, was the narrative that was told. And even if we take a much more charitable view of older adults and their motivations, nonetheless, most Americans are pretty nationalistic. I remember one study that showed that we were the most nationalistic after the Irish. We really think that the U.S. is great, and so we assume that everyone coming here is drawn by our affluence or by our political system or whatever. But older adults, that wasn't their motivation. Now, that's not to say they didn't like U.S. plumbing. And it's not to say that a lot of them weren't really wowed by the abundance of our supermarkets. And I gotta tell you, no iron, permanent press clothing really was a big hit, particularly with women. And yeah, the programs for older adults, well, those were nice, but that's not why they came. Sure, many of you can guess that if you're coming in later life, you're coming from family. And they said they came here to be close to family members who had settled in the United States, mostly children. Now, an older Iranian man really summed it up. Here's what he said. He said, quote, "Alone, without my children, how can I enjoy life?" So they were coming to continue those family relationships, and by coming, many of them also hope to be able to do things that parents do, namely help their children in one way or another. Now, U.S. immigration law, with its unique emphasis on family reunification, is what makes it possible for older people whose children have immigrated to follow them. This is the case in many countries. And unlike other immigration categories, many other immigration categories, there are no caps on the number of parental visas for permanent residency that can be issued. So there are no long waiting lists. It's really quite an extraordinary situation. And so last time I checked, about 60,000 people a year are immigrating to the United States, sponsored by their children. And this is a number that will probably rise as more and more immigrants naturalize and more people become eligible to sponsor their parents. Now, you have to add to that another 4.5 million people who come on temporary visitors visas every year. Some of these older tourists, they just want to see Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon and go home. But many of them are coming because they want to spend time with their relations, and particularly their immigrant children. And for some of them, A temporary visa is practically a permanent life status. There are people, for example, who will come on a 6-month visitor's visa just before it expires. They go home, do a little business there, get another visa, and they're back for another 6 months. So often there's a dedicated room to grandma who's back home renewing her visa, we found, much to our surprise. Well, knowing that older adults come for kin then led to a second insight. There's a tendency, I think, to stereotype older immigrants as abject dependents. And I can understand that. We have older adults who've been here a long time who worked in jobs that were not well paid. They've not been able to get together a whole lot of resources in old age, and they are today, yes, dependent on their children. Certainly newcomers, when they arrive, sponsored by an adult child, are dependent on their families. They live as guests in their children's home. As I mentioned, they aren't going to be very employable. They aren't immediately eligible for public benefits in most places. They may have no income of their own in the U.S., and they're going to need help navigating American society, at least for a while, because of their limited English and their lack of familiarity with U.S. Social institutions. This sounds a lot like being dependent, doesn't it? But the story is a lot more complex than that. The story is really one of interdependence rather than dependence, because it became very apparent in interviewing older adults that older adults give as well as get. They make big contributions to their families as long as they are able to do so. So what do? Well, tons of domestic contributions. They do babysitting, housekeeping, a lot of cooking, gardening, nursing the sick, comforting the grieved. These sound like sort of female-type roles, and they are. They're a natural extension of being a mother. But there are also sort of masculine chores that were reported, things like household maintenance or automobile repairs. They also tend to contribute in small ways to helping the family make ends meet. You know, older immigrants would patrol the local thrift stores looking for bargains. Or they would take in piecework, sewing, for example. Or, I used to see an older man in my neighborhood on a bicycle a lot, and he was collecting aluminum cans for recycling. So small ways they're also bringing in money. To get a sense of the magnitude of these contributions, let me share with you what an 83-year-old woman had to say. She'd done some help with other grandchildren as they were growing up, doing some babysitting. But the real challenge in her life had occurred 5 years ago. She moved in with her youngest son when he had twin boys. So she's dealing with 2 5-year-old boys. She explains her routine as this. I wake up early and give them food and drink. I cook for the kids because the parents work. I care and bathe them. I make lunch and rest when they go to school, but I don't rest much because I clean, wash clothes, and then fold laundry. Then they come home and I change their clothes and give them food. Then I cook again for dinner, wash dishes, and then I sleep. I sleep with the twins on either side. This is quite a day. These sorts of contributions really take on even more significance if we consider that moving, particularly at this age, involves sacrifice. There are good reasons that most of us will age in place. Use the good gerontological term. We're probably going to choose to grow old in the comfort of familiar surroundings where we lived our whole lives. A lot of these older newcomers have made these extraordinary traverses of geographic and cultural distance. And that's extraordinarily wrought with anxieties. There was one older woman we interviewed who recalled having been pressured into immigrating by her daughter. and she was interviewed by her granddaughter, and she told her that she had been invited, this is a common term used, invited by her daughter to come babysit because the daughter was having real trouble with babysitters and was just desperate to get reliable help. So the woman explains this to the granddaughter. She says, your mommy was very, what do you call it? Persistent, suggested the granddaughter. Yeah, to come here. Yeah, and I don't like to come here. I was crying and crying. Abba, she is always mad at me at the telephone and crying. And you know, I don't want to come here because I cannot eat. I cannot sleep. I do not want to leave my children, the ones who are in the Philippines still. And I think that the Philippines is too far from the United States to travel. That is the first time I will travel by air. I'm nervous all the time when I think of it. I become thinner. Well, ultimately, she decides to immigrate because she turns out she winds up under pressure, not only from her daughter in the States, but also from the kids back in the Philippines who are saying, Mom, you can immigrate right away, and then you can become a citizen in a few years, and then you can sponsor our immigration. But it doesn't sound like someone who was coming to see Disneyland. This is someone for whom this was a real sacrifice. Now, beyond the sort of practical help, the domestic assistance, the babysitting, and so on that you see from older adults, you also see that they are often the cultural glue that are holding immigrant families together. They transmit culture, they maintain those transnational ties. In many ways, they unite the family. I know from my students that it seems to be the grandmothers who take a lot of calls from homesick college students, for example. Now, you remember the grandmother who was reminding her grandson about his relatives in the Philippines. Well, here's another example of older adults keeping culture. Older adults who are preserving what they see as appropriate values in their family. The middle generation might be too busy to attend to religious instruction, but that didn't stop an older Mexican woman from making sure that her children her grandchildren grew up valuing family and faith. She went out and she bought this little box of cards, and imprinted on each box, on each card, was a different Bible verse. And that became how she motivated religious instruction. She said, I've already taught all my children and all my grandchildren that we must thank the Lord before we eat. Now, all my grandchildren know about reading these cards. They sit on the table and they ask whose turn it is to read the message. So I think this is now a family tradition, because now all of them know, and this must be done, and we are more united as a family. And we heard this over and over again, where grandparents saw their role as really extending the culture into the third generation. In fact, we called older adults like this the designated prayer, because they were often the only people in the household who had the time, the motivation, and the knowledge to carry out a number of spiritual functions. And everyone, most of the family members were pretty happy somebody was praying for them, even if they weren't doing it themselves. Well, what else can we learn? One of the things I had expected was that the opinions of older adults, that the opinions of older adults would really count for a lot of these families. And I think that came from the fact that a number of these families came from cultures which had traditionally been characterized by high levels of respect for older adults. And so I kept looking for the godfather. I was looking for Marlon Brando, gently dictating the lives of the younger generation. Well, I didn't find that. In fact, what I found was that older members of families typically do not call the shots if they're in the intergenerational family. We know that power often comes from having resources, and they didn't have a paycheck. They made valuable contributions, but they usually weren't in a position to say, take it or leave it, I'm going back to Mexico if you don't do things my way. And so they tended to need to get along with the younger generation. They often wound up compromising if there was a difference. Now, I've got to say, we did find one godfather. And this was a Middle Eastern patriot. And he was very proud of the fact that his children, always consulted him on their lives. And for example, just last week they came, one of my son wanted to buy a car, and he came to ask me what kind of car I should get. Well, then it sort of comes out that he's giving his son money to buy the car. So no wonder he's being asked, his opinion is being sought. But most older immigrants wind up referring to their children who are more familiar with American society. And a sociologist might say that older adults wind up trading subordination for support in the U.S. So that was something of a surprise for me. But here's how one woman framed it. She says, "What's my role?" Well, my role is the mother, and well, I cannot say that I'm the boss. They or children are the boss because it is their household. I'm just living with them, and my role is only as a mother. And similarly, for a Taiwanese woman who visited her daughter a couple of times a year, I only come to stay for a very short period of time, so I respect my daughter's way of living. It's like taking a taxi. If I don't like the music a taxi driver plays, I won't interrupt its choice. I only take the taxi for a very short period of time, but the taxi driver has to drive the car for a whole day. And I tell you, I've never gotten in a taxi and felt the same way since yes. Well, let me end with one last lesson from older immigrants. There's much to admire in immigrant family life. For example, whether due to cultural preferences or perhaps economic constraints, these families often offer older family members a degree of support that we don't see in other American families. There are, for example, those big multi-generational households that provide a home for older family members. There's a quite common reliance on family care as opposed to formal services to support older adults. So it's easy to kind of romanticize the warm embrace of the youth life and to assume that families on their own buffer older immigrants against the exigencies of older life. That's what I thought going in, but the interviews really led to a different conclusion because older immigrants make it very clear that the warm embrace of immigrant families is no guarantee of happiness. And instead, they talked a lot about boredom, loneliness, depression, and as we heard from Sergio last night and several of the papers today, older immigrants have higher risks of depression and psychological depression or distress than do other individuals. And this is particularly the case of older newcomers. And yet, paradoxically, they are often socially isolated in big extended households. They come from families where there's often high expectation of sociability and companionship that are not met. These expectations are not met in the U.S., so they find themselves unprepared for the circumstances that they encounter in the U.S. And I have a lovely quote from somewhere. Lovely quote. "I get lonely because my husband died, especially when I'm left alone, home alone. I do nothing sometimes, just staring out the window or pray. I pray the novena, and when it's time to sleep, I pray the rosary 3 times. I don't like it when it's nighttime and I'm alone. I get scared. Maybe there'll be a burglar or a ghost or something. I'm not used to being left alone. only here in the US that I experienced being alone at night. Where she came from, in the Philippines, we had maids at the house if other people went out at night. And of course, my friends came over a lot. So you can see the disjuncture here between life in the US and life in homeland. Now, newcomers particularly are often socially isolated because they don't have many opportunities to make friends, and particularly friends their own age outside the family. And this is doubly true if they're living outside an ethnic enclave. Limited English, a lack of transportation, low income, etc., can all restrict their activities and their socializing. And even before they become frail or disabled and those sorts of problems of later life slow them down, older immigrants can wind up sort of housebound. They're housebound by those babysitting responsibilities or the housekeeping contributions that they make to their families. They just aren't able to get out much. And even if they share housing with kin, they may find little companionship from younger generations who are, after all, busy, making a living, going to school, trying to get a toehold in American society. And finally, widowhood often removes the one sort of peer in their social worlds, leaving them particularly lonely and bereft. Let me offer an example of how difficult it is for an older Latina who had to rely on family to get out into the community. Who did she count on for transportation? Well, grandson Joe, because he knows how to drive, and sometimes Rafi, he's the son, like when I have to go to the doctors or something. I don't have to go out, only when they're not tired, and if they can drive me, I don't want to have any problems, because when people are tired, they have hot heads. If they can take me, great. If they cannot, it's okay too. So you get some sense of how constrained life can be for these very giving older adults in families. And we might fault the younger generations, but they undoubtedly face their own challenges and their own demands in American society. Well, I've touched on 4 lessons that I learned from interviews with older immigrants. These are lessons that challenge the stereotypes I have, and I think a lot of myths that are out there and assumptions about older adults in America's immigrant families. Some of those myths are that, for example, that they're drawn to the abundance and opportunities of American society in a way that younger labor migrants might be, that they're abject dependents, that they're powerful patriarchs calling the shots in multi-generational families, or that the warm embrace of family life can protect them against the loneliness and psychological difficulties that may come to other adults in American society. But instead, I found other lessons. Older adults come here to be with family members who live in the U.S., that they give as well as get, at least as long as their health permits. In short, they are not dependents, but rather interdependents, that they defer to the needs and preferences of the younger generation, and that they're not immune to loneliness and depression, even if they do enjoy an unusually high degree of family support. They still have issues. These were my keynotes. Now, talks usually end with a call for further research, and boy, did I come to the right place. Look at all the further research going on. This is great. And I'm confident that you are responding to the call, but there's also usually a lament that we need more and better data, and I'll do that too. I'd love to validate these qualitative insights with quantitative data. Now, my particular interest in this study was to try to identify some of the common concerns that unite older immigrants by virtue of their age and by virtue of the immigrant experience. And those include things like Quite typical concerns about the rapid Americanization of grandchildren, concerns about a spouse's health, concerns about who's going to take care of them when they're too old to take care of themselves. We see this across many different groups, but I'd love to see more data sets with big enough samples to permit a comparison of immigrant groups, for example. But I also want to end with a call for more theoretical cross-pollinization between studies of aging and research on immigration. In studies of immigrants, timing in lives deserves to be as important a principle as it is from the life course perspective. And I was delighted to see immigration timing come into several of the papers this morning. In identifying the 1.5 generation, I call it Urban Rumba, really was among the first to stress the importance of this intersection of the immigration event and its timing in the life course. So of course, those who immigrate as children adapt readily, and given their high level of incorporation, they grow up to look a lot like the second generation. But I want to point out that later life immigrants lag behind in incorporation. They are what I call if there's the 1.5 generation, I like to call the older immigrants, those people come later in life, the 0.5 generation, because they lag behind. They can't keep up with their grandchildren or even ever catch up with their older peers who immigrated, say, during their working years. And our own informants repeatedly lamented the difficulty of learning to speak English. When your memory's not so good, and when dentures keep you from getting your tongue around some of those sounds. Well, mindful of the struggle of later immigrants, I also, though, want to point out that timing in the life course is not just an issue for older adults. It's not just about where people wind up later in life. And I think we have a wonderful example there, regrettably, in DACA, which offered dreamers a reprieve from deportation. But that was only for unauthorized immigrants who met certain criteria. Among them was being under the age of 31 and entering the United States before age 16. So this brought real benefits for some young adults, but their slightly older siblings didn't have the benefit because of inauspicious timing. They were too old at immigration, they were too old at the start of the program. So timing in lives is something, a concept I'd like to see imported into the study of aging and immigration from studies in the course. Now, as a thought exercise, it's really not hard to go back through my talk and find other general life course principles that are highlighted in the immigrant experience. Grand old man of the life course, Group Elder, pointed to the importance of time and place. And certainly these older immigrants coming today to reunite with their children would not be able to come if they weren't in the right time and in the right place. They're here in the U.S., a country that has chosen to emphasize family reunification with enabling legislation in this particular period of time dating from the 60s. And similarly, if you want to think about the life course principle of linked lives, this looms large if we think not only about those parental visas, but about the sort of intergenerational independence we see in families, the way in which lives are linked in families. And lastly, is there a better illustration of that life course principle of the individual agency than the very act of immigrating, whether it's an individual or a family decision, that decision to immigrate. And particularly how much agency is involved for older adults who are bucking the usual pattern of aging in place. So when we study older immigrants, we have an opportunity to learn from older adults who were for a long time neglected by research on aging and by research on immigration. By bringing together the two fields of aging and immigration, older immigrants, older newcomers, 0.5 generation, stand to enrich both fields. So here's where your research comes in. And I'd really very much like to turn the floor over to you to discuss what you've learned about older adults from your research. Thank you.
The floor is open.
Yes.
Yeah, so these older adults who come as immigrants, do you know what happens as their health deteriorates? Is there a tendency for them then to stay here because they have family support, or do they return to their countries of origin because maybe care is more accessible and affordable? What's your experience?
A little of both, and I can't say which pattern would be more common. There are older adults who return home. And often it seemed to be, with the Latino immigrants, it was often a factor that it was just so expensive to live in California. So they would return home where the cost of living was much less. One went back to a rancho and came out and visited it every year. Another couple retired to Tijuana, and he came across the border quite often, and they would come up here and get their Medicare and so on. So that worked well with them. I think a lot of people talk about going home. And in fact, some of them will say, oh, everybody talks about it. Nobody's going to do that. So there is sort of a longing to go home. But it's also can be discouraging to those people who go home, even on a visit. Because if you're gone for any length of time, things change. What you remember as a bucolic village has now been swallowed up by a large city. You have to worry about crime, you have to worry about air pollution, you have to worry about traffic. It's no longer a sort of romantic village of your youth. Your friends have moved away, many have died. So often when they go home, people find that home is not waiting for them anymore. So those are those who think to leave. But what happens to many older adults is I think they come here assuming that this may be a temporary situation. They're just coming to take care of these kids. They won't need them in another 10 years. But life intervenes. Perhaps they have health problems that make it impossible for them to travel back and forth across long distances, or mean that they require family care. And they wind up really marooned in the U.S. This is not where they intended to live out their lives, but this is how things work out. So I think you have both narratives out there among older adults who are coming and leaving.
In your introduced, do you ever get a sense of what happens to older immigrants or Hispanics and others in cases of dementia of the older parent? Have you come across that?
You
keep saying anecdotally.
Yeah, the problem with people with dementia is they make terrible interview subjects. We don't have many interviews with them. There's some unanalyzed data out there with their grandchildren, and this comes up from time to time. But I really can't claim to know much about it based on.
There's this sense we have that dementia is more likely to be tolerated in these ethnic groups, which is good news and then bad news at the same time because they don't necessarily get the care they may need.
Well, I was wondering whether or not any of these folks were being brought from Mexico in particular, or any place in Central America, to the United States because they were dementing and that they needed the extra care, or was there any type of illness, the reverse, where if these folks needed care and the children were all here?
Yeah, it may be a function of our sample and the fact that we were young adults who were identifying people who were probably not that
Or that's just
That
money
all,
going
yeah,
back
but,
home and
you
there's
know,
more caregiving.
but yeah, we did not get, there were a few people who seemed quite frail. Although, I guess what surprised me is that there were older adults in the sample who you and I would probably say, boy, she's done. She has the string of health problems out the door. You probably would have a hard time walking across the living room, but still, these people were very engaged with their family lives, and they were still doing a lot of domestic work, cooking for their entire family. And I remember one woman who had a lot of health problems. She lived with her son. She did all the housekeeping for him in a very large home, and then her daughter and son-in-law and their children got every evening for dinner. So she was also having to cook for a large family, but she had all these health problems. And you would think that you'd expect other adults to say, I'm done, or their kids to say, you're retired by that period of time. But this was so much of but she wasn't that good.
You gave a nice focus on looking at older adults that have moved to the United States, which I think is a neat perspective. It's a nice way to organize it. I think of some of these issues as far as the family as a major social institution. And if you think of that, in many instances, the family can be positive, it can protect family members, but sometimes you get different people that sacrifice one person for another in caregiving roles and helping and doing some other kind of interaction. So even though you got kind of a mixed story of pros and cons of older immigrants, I kind of look and think for the family overall, it looks like the family as a unit still benefits, even though there may be some sacrifices along the way. And if you think not of the older immigrant, but of the kids or the grandkids or the extended family, there's some benefits. And if you think of the counterfactual of the immigrants, if they would have stayed where they were, they could be in much worse shape, that they would have been isolated, they wouldn't have had the same social support, so it's probably beneficial. So do you see this overall as something that benefits the family or benefits other family members, even if it doesn't benefit the older immigrants, or are there still some real downsides?
Well, this may be as much a value perspective as anything, but I think the older immigrants that we're seeing are really a net gain to their families, and hence a net gain to all of us, because I think they do enable their families to move forward, to move up, to advance in American society, because they are providing so many services and so much help. But that's just my perspective. I know there are also, we have colleagues out there who discovered that older immigrants are, naturalizing, and they're getting Medicare, and golly, they're old, they're going to cost us a lot of money, and maybe you need to rethink this idea of the parent visa. But I've got to say, also, you brought out one thing, which is, I don't think virtually none of the older adults we talked to had any complaints with their children. Their children were all fine. But a number of them had a story about other people's children who brought them to the U.S. to exploit them. And you can kind of see a little of this in the interviews of older people who are being worked very hard, whose needs are not being met, who perhaps aren't getting the consideration. And it's unfair because we don't hear the stories from the kids and the grandkids on why I'm not staying home with grandma and she's left alone.
So have you looked at any of this data in terms of care chains? So the question just before this sort of, if they'd stayed behind, what would they have been doing? So if they're coming here and helping their families here, are there families now in the Philippines or in Mexico and India that are having to make do some other way?
Well, often people here are sending remittances back. But I did notice, for example, among some of the people, particularly the Filipinos, Vietnamese, they seem to be hedging their bets. They were sending money home, but they would also occasionally talk about, if I got really ill and I couldn't stay here. And I think this was the fear, will my children be able to take care of me? I could go home to the Philippines and my sister's child who will inherit the farm would take care of me. So I think there is some of that going on.
Judy, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
We want to give you